All right, folks, so here we are starting our last kind of unit here for the semester. This one we're going to focus on the 1990s. So it's kind of interesting. It's the first time I've ever had a chance to teach the 90s in this class, so that's kind of fun. It's a time period I remember very well. I grew up largely in the 1990s, and so, um, a lot of the things I'll be talking about in this unit are really, things that I remember personally and things that being relevant and culturally significant during this time period. So there'll be a lot of stuff here, and I'll try to connect as many stories as I can to things that are relevant here and things that I've done. But we'll get started right into it. So, a little background into the 1990s, which that's the second one. So sorry about that. Um, so when the 90s start, you've got George H.W. Bush, Daddy Bush, um, God rest his soul, as President of the United States. And, while he was vice president with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, they effectively, brought an end to the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So when the 90s start, we're largely at a time where we're seeing the kind of power structure of the world changing significantly, and the U.S. Clearly being the only real superpower in the world during this time. Okay, so with the Cold War kind of coming to an end here in 1991, it would officially end. New concerns and new issues really started to uh, become significant to people in the 1990s. Uh, the popular culture of the 1980s kind of quickly comes to a dead stop when the 1990s hit. If you watch, say, a TV, if you were to watch an episode of a TV show from, say, 1989, and then watch an episode of a similar TV show from, say, 1992, it'll seem like a big difference. And kind of, it's indicative of the way that our society was changing by the early 1990s as new things were becoming available to people. Computers and things like that were starting to take over more and more people with cell phones or car phones at that time, phones that would be mounted in people's cars that could be used in there were popular. We're seeing a lot of aspects of culture that uh, kind of started a little bit in the 1980s, but in the 90s they really explode. So you see a real definite end point to the 80s at the end of the decade and a jump into the 90s where the culture focuses even more on young people. Musically, you see a lot of change. Rap music becomes much bigger in the 1990s and becomes consumed by more and more people, particularly whites. 70% of hip hop and rap record sales in the 1980s, 70% were by white people, even though the music was categorized as more of a African American music or black person's music, right? So we see these cultural aspects from the 1980s kind of quickly give way to this new culture of the 1990s, which means for the first time we're focusing on a new generation of people. The baby boomers had dominated since the 1960s, since they rose up in the 1960s and protested the Vietnam War and civil rights and did their disco and became serial killers or whatever it was during the 1970s. And then as they became parents of young children in the 1980s, and they moved into that more professional environment and stuff like that. Everything had really been catered to people from this baby boomer generation, people born from 1946 to 1964. Okay. By the 1990s, the next generation of people, Generation Xers, and people that are born from about 1965 to 1977, start to become the focal point of advertising, start to play a more critical role in society. We see more and more TV shows that, kind of center around people that were born somewhere in this time frame. If you're talking about, I know everybody knows Friends, like all of them would be considered kind of Generation Xers. And we see, their aspects and their ideologies, which are different from what the baby boomers believe. Um, they might not be as keen to focus on, giving the best job and having all the best things and showing that stuff off. While labels are important and stuff of that nature, it's a generation of people that have some more interest in social issues and causes. And they also uh, are at the end of the day, really represent a more educated um, generation of people than their predecessors. Okay. While there was a lot more people in generation, um, there were a lot more people that got, educations in the baby boomer generation. By Generation X, you know, you're seeing that even more. One of the big changes we see also in the decade, and we'll get to this later, is the booming popularity of sports, particularly women's sports, growing throughout the 1990s. So, and if you're watching The Last Dance, you're seeing how big the NBA was in basketball during this time. The sports culture during this time is becoming more relevant than ever before and more familiar to what we like today. All right. So, what are the top 10 events of the 1990s? I'll mention some here, some of the ones we'll get into later on, right? For one, you've got the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, killed a handful of people. It wasn't the 9/11. It was 8 years before, and it was actually carried out by Al Qaeda, carried out by the same organization that did 9/11. Um, but it was a pretty big deal in 1993, this bombing of the World Trade Center. I think it killed like 6 people. It certainly woke us up to a new concern, which is no longer the Soviet Union and Cold War, but the possibilities of terrorism. Another bombing. There's a lot of bombings, and this should be, yeah. Um, the Olympic Park bombing in 1996. A guy by the name of Eric Rudolph uh, put off a bomb in like the Olympic Park during the Olympics in 1996. It was caught on TV. Uh, I'm not sure if it killed anybody. I know some folks were injured, but again, it's something that happened during the Olympics, so it made it a bigger deal. Like Jesse Owens in 1936, like the hostages in Munich in 1972, the Olympic Park bombing in 1996. Again, was a big deal and big news, and another example of bombing and terrorist threats in the United States. Here's another bomber. Okay, the Unabomber was kind of like a serial killer bomber, a guy by the name of Ted Kaczynski, who had Americans for years sending these pipe bombs through the mail that would explode and kill different people or seriously injure them. Note all three of these are bombings, but two of them are terrorist attacks, and they're done by domestic terrorists, meaning they're other Americans that are responsible for committing these acts of terrorism. Um, I remember the Unabomber was a big deal. Everybody was afraid of this guy when he was going to strike next, and finally they caught him in like 1996. He had been doing these bombings for like 15, 16 years, all the way back to the late 70s. Some people even think that tried to make the connection that maybe he was the Zodiac killer as well. That was famous serial killer in the late 60s and early 70s in San Francisco. Now, one of the big events in the 1970s, I'll send you a couple of videos associated with this, were the LA riots. The LA riots, we'll get into that more later on, but this was certainly a big seminal moment and violent moment for America during the 1990s. Another big one was the raid on the Branch Davidian complex in Waco, Texas, or the Waco, Texas raid in 1993. The government came under a lot of scrutiny for this because of the way they handled it, but basically, this was a cult, kind of similar to like Jim Jones in Jonestown. This was a cult in um, Texas, led by a guy named David Koresh, who, like Jim Jones, made claims that he was this Christ-like figure and all this stuff. And they heard that they were mistreating, children and things, and there were sexual assaults or whatever going on. So the government raided this complex, and then ultimately Koresh and almost everybody there killed themselves. There were a few people that got away or left or weren't there at the time of the raid. But this was huge news in the early 1990s. Of course, the Columbine shooting in 1999. This brings a full stop to the way high school was, right? The reason you have IDs with your name on them, that you need to use the ID to get to school every day, that's all because of Columbine. Okay, when Columbine happened, I was a freshman in college, and I remember when I came home at the end of the school year, at the end of my freshman year, I went back to visit my old high school, and it had become a totally different place. You needed to sign in. You couldn't just walk through the doors. There were security guards and people like that in the building. And obviously, Columbine is kind of looked to as kind of the beginning of this trend, the unfortunate trend of school shootings. Another one of the big events that would normally be much higher would be the Persian Gulf War. Uh, the Persian Gulf War, in many ways, made up for the failure of Vietnam. The United States dominated Iraq in this war, um, and the total number of casualties for the U.S. in this were like I think under 200 soldiers were killed. Um, but it was the first war we'd really been in since the first war we'd really been in since the Vietnam War, and obviously that didn't go well. The Persian Gulf War, our military might was clearly shown. The United States dominated, and it kind of helped to get over to a certain degree what was viewed by many as the failures of Vietnam. President George H.W. Bush, uh, the war went so well in the Persian Gulf, people were so happy about it that in April of 1991, his approval rating was over 90%. He's the only president of the United States to ever have an approval rating over 90%. Another act of domestic terror, maybe the worst one, was the Oklahoma City bombing, where almost 170 Americans were killed by a guy named Tim McVeigh, not the one that went to Alter, and a guy named Terry Nichols when they had a bomb. What are we talking here? Oh, sorry. Where they had a bomb outside the federal building in Oklahoma City. Many people were killed, um, and it's another example of domestic terrorism. Tim McVeigh was a member of the Branch Davidians, and was really upset with the government by the way they intervened in this Branch Davidian raid in 1993. Probably one of, if not the biggest manhunt for Timothy McVeigh went on immediately after the Oklahoma City bombing. Ultimately, he was captured and given the death sentence. But this is probably the worst act, the single worst act of domestic terrorism in the United States history, meaning terrorism that is done against America by another American. The last two here, I'll talk about these later. Of course, there's the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal and the subsequent impeachment of Clinton. And then obviously the biggest story of the 1990s definitely are O.J. Simpson. So get into this stuff a little bit more. So let's talk a little bit about the presidency of Bill Clinton. There's Bill right there, Slick Willie and Monica Lewinsky. And, you can't see that too well, but it's kind of a measure of the approval rating of Bill Clinton during his presidency, which was very, very high, even in the time period when he was dealing with the Lewinsky scandal. So, all right. It's the first time since the 1950s in which the United States only has two presidents for an entire decade. Okay. George Bush is beginning, and then the rest of the way it's Bill Clinton. So just as much as Ronald Reagan dominates the 1980s, Bill Clinton dominates the 1990s. He's always in the news. He's the first baby boomer to ever be elected to the presidency. Okay, so he's the first one born during the baby boom generation to become president of the United States. So he spoke to kind of and reached out to really a wide variety of Americans, and the baby boomer generation felt they had somebody that could, that could identify with them, just like in the 1960s, the way people felt, the greatest generation people felt about JFK. So there were a lot of comparisons between Bill Clinton and JFK in that regard. In 1992, he wins an election. Um, uh, pretty handily at the end of the day over George H.W. Bush and a third party candidate named Ross Perot, Perot, who was a strong third party candidate who got almost 19% of the vote in the whole country and really hurt Bush a lot more than Clinton. And we have the Bill Clinton presidency beginning in 1992. Now, his presidency, of course, was beset with a lot of personal issues and problems. We know about Monica Lewinsky, which probably don't know much about is Whitewater and the death of Vince Foster. Okay, now the Whitewater controversy or the Whitewater affair was the government looked into these potentially illegal business dealings that Clinton had while he was governor of Arkansas in the late 1970s, and thought that he may have used his influence as governor to get to kind of get favorable contracts and things like that. Now, it turned out that he was never convicted of anything, or was Hillary, but there was a lot of suggestion that he may have been involved with that. Another thing was the kind of the controversial death of one of the White House counsels, one of the lawyers for the White House, Vince Foster, who was a lifelong friend of Clinton, who was found dead in 1993 to a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Everybody concluded that Foster did commit suicide because he was despondent and didn't like working in politics in Washington. But there's always been a lot of conspiracy theories out there that the Clintons maybe had Vince Foster killed. And then, of course, most notably is the Monica Lewinsky scandal. She was a White House intern that Bill Clinton had a quote-unquote inappropriate relationship with. This dominated news in the last part of the decade, ultimately resulting in the impeachment of Bill Clinton. Okay, he was the second president to be impeached after Andrew Johnson, and now, of course, Trump's been impeached, so that's three. But it was a big deal. I think the most interesting thing, and it really speaks to Clinton, is like I said before, even though he was going through this whole impeachment thing, his approval rating was still very high during that time, usually over 60%. Obviously, ultimately, he admitted he had first lied, and that's what he got in trouble for. A lot of people get confused. Clinton didn't get in trouble because he had a extramarital relationship with Lewinsky. He got in trouble because he perjured himself when he lied about having the relationship. Ultimately, he admitted to it. He apologized to the American people and gave a good speech about that. And then, went back to work, and that was the end of that story. They went through the whole impeachment process in the House and Senate. Of course, the Senate did not vote him out, and he, continued on as president. One of the things that is interesting about Clinton, right? So the economy did very well during his presidency, especially during the second term, and that certainly helped his image during this whole thing. But Clinton, politically, is what you call very much a centrist, or very much a moderate. He's not like super Democrat or anything like that. And this allowed him to accomplish a lot as president because he was able to work with people on both sides. He was able to work with Republicans and Democrats to get things done. And one of the things this resulted in was the first balanced budget that we'd ever had since, in many years, like maybe since the 50s, and certainly a lot of economic growth. He had even though the Republicans controlled the House of Representatives during a good part of his presidency, he was still able to accomplish a lot of these things. And this is why generally the presidency, not as much the guy, but the presidency of Bill Clinton is remembered very fondly. We also see with Hillary, and obviously we know because she's run for president a couple times, she's probably the most active first lady in terms of being politically involved than anything we've seen. Obviously Melania Trump doesn't really get involved in much. Other first ladies like Nancy Reagan was very involved in the war on drugs, but wasn't involved in much in political things. Michelle Obama wasn't involved in much in political things, right? She pushed for healthy eating habits and stuff, but Hillary was very involved in a lot of the political side of her husband's presidency, which is something we hadn't really seen before. Okay, so moving on from there, we'll talk a little bit about the social climate during the 1990s. This is the bombing of Oklahoma City in 1995 of the federal building. So you can see that much of the building was blown up or destroyed there. You've got the DARE sign, which was a big thing about keeping kids off drugs, obviously. And then here's a scene from the LA riots in 1992. Okay, like I said before, this was the first decade that we'd have since the 50s that the United States only has two presidents. This is important because we have a lot of continuity there. Um, Now, the interesting thing about Bush and Clinton was they're both very different. Um, Bush was very much a family values guy, much carried out a lot of things that Reagan believed. Bill Clinton came out and appealed to a much younger generation of people with his ideas and his beliefs. And this is really what elevated him to the presidency. One of the big problems in the early 1990s, and this was always all over the news, was the fear of gang violence in the inner cities. Um, you'd see the drug wars, and there'd be stories every day on the news about the number of people that are being killed by gun violence and drive-by shootings and things that happen uh, way too frequently during the 1990s. Kids would get killed for their jackets because these starter jackets were really popular, and if you wore it and it was like a gang's colors or something like that, somebody might shoot you to take your jacket, or if you had a new fresh pair of Jordans or something like that, somebody might beat you up to take your shoes. Like these kind of things weren't uncommon in inner city environments in the 1990s, and gang violence and those things uh, were at an all-time high. You hear a lot about it now in Chicago in particular, where there's a lot of violence. But this was all over the country. Every city had a gang problem. So we did things to kind of educate youth about drugs and the problems of drug use. I remember being one of the first to go through the DARE program where they taught us about the dangers of drug use and that sort of thing. Uh, but it's a big part of the climate for the period. So uh, as the decade wore on, we started to get interested and involved in different issues. Social issues became more prominent to people, particularly uh, as a result of the racial issues that came up from the Rodney King riot, or from the Rodney King case and riots in LA. Rodney King was a African American who was brutally beaten by police. I'll send you a video footage of it. And it sparked this big racial controversy in Los Angeles. Ultimately, the five police officers that were accused of using excessive force on him were acquitted, even though there was a video of him getting beaten. And they were acquitted of any wrongdoing. And this set off the LA riots, which were violent. You can see the fires in the background. It was the worst racial riot of the 20th century. Over 50 people were killed. Storefronts were destroyed. People lost a lot of money. Uh, and it really exposed that the race issues in America that were uh, kind of not as evident during the 1980s were still very much a problem in the 1990s. African American relationship with the police, a lot of the stuff that these gangster rappers of the era would sing about. These problems that they so often had to deal with. But the LA riots were horrible. There were people getting beaten and shot and killed, and it was extremely violent. Okay. Uh, by the end of the decade, we're no longer worried about the Cold War. So by the end of the 1990s, the big fear is terrorism. Okay. Uh, we've had a few terrorist attacks, in particular domestic terrorism, like in Oklahoma City, would be the most notable one. And then, certainly after the 90s and on 9/11, we'd have the worst one ever, which was obviously the Twin Towers. Um, but our fear in terms of what is a threat to America is becoming less and less communism and other government threats, but unsanctioned terrorist actions from from Americans, domestic terrorism, and from abroad. We talked about Oklahoma City already, and of course the Columbine shooting. We talked about that too. Obviously, the biggest story that, and this will be our last thing, I know this is kind of long. The biggest story of the 1990s is without question the O.J. Simpson trial. This changed the way we consume television. I'm telling you, I remember this so vividly. That week, we had just finished eighth grade, and there was a story that OJ's his estranged wife had been killed along with her friend here, Ron Goldman, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. And I remember I was at like my select baseball team game the next day after it was on the news, and we're all talking about like, oh, there's no way he could have killed anybody, couldn't have killed anybody. I mean, this guy was famous. Like now we just think of OJ as this terrible guy that killed people, but he was really likable. He was one of the first African American athletes to be really, really marketable. So he was a big, guy for advertising different goods. He was a TV commentator. He was an actor, and obviously was a great football player. So we admired him because he was a great football player. Uh, and really one of the most recognizable people in America. Now everybody knows who OJ is because of what happened here, with the murder and everything. But most people knew who OJ Simpson was before this happened. He was a great football player, one of the best ever running back, won a Heisman Trophy. People knew OJ Simpson. Okay, and this case for a year and a half is all anybody talked about. It was on the news constantly. Every day there would be an update on O.J. Simpson. If you watch Sports Center, every day there would be a update on O.J. Simpson. They would make a joke out of it almost, where like the Sports Center guys would be like, "Okay, now on to the O.J. Simpson part of our broadcast," because every day there would be updates on what was going on with O.J. Okay. Now he was accused of killing his estranged wife, he was separated from, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, Ron Goldman. Now the case was really interesting. There was so much evidence. There was so much evidence to suggest that O.J. Simpson was guilty, but again, he was famous, he was influential, so he ended up, being found not guilty. Maybe the most famous moment of the whole O.J. Simpson trial, the whole O.J. Simpson thing, he was supposed to turn himself into police like the Thursday after, like the whole story broke on a Monday, and the Thursday after they wanted to question him or arrest O.J. Simpson because they thought he was responsible for this murder, and what happens is he's supposed to turn himself in, but he doesn't. So he's got this friend of his, Al Collins, who's driving him down the 405 freeway in Los Angeles in this low-speed car chase in a Ford Bronco. And this made like national, it's all over television. I remember Game 5 of the 1994 NBA Finals was that night. And everybody was want to watch the basketball game 5 of the NBA Finals, and they keep cutting out of the game to show you this news footage of this chase. You never see something like that today because we have our news channels and stuff that would cover that, so you don't have to miss the game. But this was a big, big deal. And when O.J. Simpson was found not guilty, I remember being at school, and this is before we had internet and all that stuff. And they've announced I was a sophomore in high school, and they announced over the PA at the school that OJ was found not guilty, right? And the sad thing is, like me and my friends were like, yeah, we were all excited because he's a football hero and everything. Like, he's free and everything, and that's good. Now when I think about it now, I'm like, dude definitely killed those people. But so I kind of feel bad about it from that. But anyway, that was the thing, right? So many people involved with the O.J. Simpson case became big time celebrities. Probably most notable is one of O.J.'s good friends was a lawyer named Robert Kardashian, who is the father of perhaps the worst family in the world. Kim and all those other stupid ones. So we see all these celebrities that come out of it. Judge Lancito, Johnny Cochran, F. Lee Bailey, Kato Kalin. People get their own TV shows and things, after the O.J. Simpson trial because it's such a big deal. Anyway, folks, that's all I've got today. This one was super long. I'm really sorry about that. That's all.